Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Judge Kevin Washington. I am the chairman of the Town of Windsor Human Relations Commission. And this is our first conversation on race for this year. We plan to have conversations on race for the remainder of the year through our next fiscal year, which is up until June. So with that, I'm going to get started. Again, welcome. It is wonderful to have you all. We are having this conversation on race, on critical race theory. It is not a tug of war. We're not saying one side is right, one side is wrong, but we want you to take from this education and information and make your own decisions, have a good, tolerable discussion. Before I get into introducing our panel, I'm going to do some housekeeping here. First, I'd like to introduce the commissioners of the Human Relations Commission, and they are Vice Chair Patricia Mack, Secretary Cassie Copeland, Commissioner Becky Jacobson, Commissioner Joshua Amaro, Commissioner Linda Massa, Commissioner Joyce Armstrong, and her husband is like our backup, Commissioner Dick Armstrong, Commissioner Byron Bob, and Commissioner Lynn Swade. Our liaison for the Human Relations Commissioner is Mr. Jim Burke, and our administrative support is Ms. Sandra Brown, who we give great thanks to for our liaison and our support. Also, just a word of note, the HRC does have a web page. If you'd like to find out more information about that and see our web page and see our events, and it posts all of our calendars, events coming up and stuff, you can check that out on the Town of Windsor website. This conversation and all other conversations will be recorded. They're recorded and kept by the town, and they also appear on our YouTube channel. So you can play back and listen, or send the YouTube to someone else and share that with people. Our next topic, and I'll just reemphasize this at the end of the program, is colorism. We'll discuss colorism. The purpose for these conversations on race is to create dialogue, have conversation. It's not to point fingers at anybody, and not saying one side is right, one side is wrong. It's not, a political debate between Republicans, Democrats, and independents. It's a conversation, it's an education, and it's just a sharing meaningful information and thought. You're free to converse. We ask that you be control yourself in regards to blaming people and things like that, because that's not what we're here for. This year, we're going to touch on a variety of topics. It's not only going to be driven toward racism, but it's going to address the whole diaspora of cultural. We're going to talk about Indigenous people, Native Americans, the Hispanic population, health disparities, you name it. But we also encourage you, if there's something you specifically want to talk about, please feel free to drop us a line, send us an email, send it to our liaison, and we'll research it and put that topic out there for discussion. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel. And each panelist will tell us a little bit about themselves, and then we'll move on. First, I'd like to introduce the facilitator for the event, and my newest my baby commissioner is Cassie Copeland. And Cassie, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to us? And
Sure thing. So hi, my name is Cassie Copeland. I'm a new member of the Windsor Human Relations Commission. I'm also an associate instructor at the International Magnet School for Global Citizen, which was now renamed to the CREC Academy of International Studies. So I work with preschool to 5th grade. I've previously done work and research with UConn and the School of NEAG, and a lot of it has been around using intersectionality within research, and also having interactivities with creative problem-based learning curriculum. So that's kind of what drew me here, is finding new formats to be able to have conversations with people. So welcome everyone, and I look forward to being a great facilitator today.
Thank you, Cassie. Our next panelist and our guest is Senator Douglas, State Senator of Connecticut, Douglas McCrory. He's with us. Hi, Senator.
Good evening. I'm glad to be here with you, Mr. Judge, Dr. Judge, the Judge Washington. I'll be very brief. My name is Senator Douglas McCrory. I represent Hartford, Bloomfield, and Windsor. I am a 28-and-a-half-year educator in the public school system. Spent 17 of those years as an educator, and the last 11 and a half as administrator in the Hartford Public School system, now currently in the CREC Magnet School system. And what I'm probably here is because I am also the first African-American chairman of the Education Committee in the state of Connecticut. So that's a little bit about
that. Thank you, Senator. That's amazing. That's amazing. Thank you so much. Our next panelist is the Connecticut State Representative, Mr. Bobby Gibson. Hi, Bobby.
Hi. Good afternoon, Your Honor. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting us. And Cassie Copeland, thank you for having us on here today. I am Bobby Gibson. I am a state representative for the 15th District, that is Bloomfield and Windsor. During my full-time day, I am a school improvement specialist at the Carmen Middle School in Bloomfield. As far as the state legislature is concerned, I serve as the vice chair of the General Law Commission. I'm on the Education Committee with also Senator McCrory. I am on the Appropriations Committee, where I am the sub-chair of the Conservation Development Committee. And I'm also the vice chair of the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus. And it's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you, sir. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time. Now, just to note to our audience, the senator and state rep have a prior commitment, so they will be dropping off after 6. So don't think that they got mad and just left, because that's not what who they are or what they do. But they will be departing from us probably around 6 o'clock or so. Our next panelist, thank you, State Rep. Our next panelist is Mrs. Lillian Hutchinson. She is with the Loomis Chaffee School. Thanks, Lillian, for being with us today.
Good evening, everyone. Before I begin, I would just like to do a really quick land acknowledgement, as I am part of, I live on land once held by the Podunks, Scantic, and Namriks, as well as the Pequannoks, Sakyogs, and Tunkses. And I want to thank the town of Windsor for inviting me to this space and for this important conversation. I'm a 25-year educator so far. Hopefully we'll have many more years under my belt as I move on. I love to teach. I'm originally from Honduras, Central America. I am the mother of 2 Windsor students. And I am not only a faculty member at Loomis, but I'm also the Associate Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And in my life, and the way I came to this is I've lived in different countries around the world and among different cultures. And I've grown to respect and appreciate the diversity therein. It is a lens that I really use in my classrooms in order to elevate the voices that have been missed in the past, so that students can really see themselves and grow. It allows them to grow and think empathetically about others. And as an educator, I think it is a part of a formula, being able to teach all the different aspects, because if we only teach one component, then we can't really come to a sum. And so we really do need to acknowledge that collective history and experiences and the intersections that we all do in order to raise awareness, so that our future students and leaders can really see everyone around. So, I'm really passionate about the work I do, and I'm glad to have this conversation with you all.
Thank you, Lillian, so much. We appreciate it so much. I have a lot to learn from you. We have some deep discussions coming up. And next, our panelist is Town Councilor Kevin Booker from New London.
Yes, thank you very much, Judge Washington. And thank you, Costello Copeland. Thank you so much for having me on this panel this evening. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And good evening, everyone. Buenos noches, bonjour, bon dia, ni hao, memenjes, dobre utro, namaste, sawadi, chawem, manganang hapum, como ye, sopa wanang sung, assalamu alaikum, privet, guten tag, and as they say in Hebrew, shalom. My name is Kevin Booker Jr., and I am the founder of Booker Empowerment LLC, where I do diversity training, leadership training, and I am also a city councilor for the city of New London, Connecticut, where I oversee public safety. Additionally, I am an adjunct professor at Connecticut College, Mitchell College, and as Nantucket Community College. And I serve on the board of directors for Isaac Charter School, as well as the Connecticut Regional Board of Directors for the Anti-Defamation League. And my motto always is, get comfortable being uncomfortable. So thank you so much. I'm looking forward to this conversation this evening.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you, Kevin, so much for being here. I appreciate you giving us your time. And we also have two students with us. We have Sage Delaney. Hi, Sage.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Sage Dehaney. I'm actually 16 years old. I'm a junior at Windsor High School. I'm a part of Leadership Council with Mr. Moore. I think he is actually here, if you guys know of him. I'm part of the National Black Corporative with Cassie Copeland. I'm part of Student Council and a member of the Student Advisory Board. And I'm a member of Windsor Greater Together Advisory Committee and a member of Black Excellence. So I do a lot of stuff at my school, and I'm very passionate about helping in my community. And I wanted to say thank you again, Cassie and everyone, for inviting me to this discussion. I'm very excited.
Thank you so much, Sage. I'm so happy to have you be a part of this conversation. I know you have a lot to offer, and I look forward to hearing from you. Our next student is Liana Duanga. Hi, Liana, how are you?
Hello, I'm Liana Dongo. I'm 15 years old. I'm a junior at Windsor High School. I'm involved with Leadership Council with Mr. Moore as well, Student Council, Future Business Leaders of America, and I'm a member of the Student Equity Advisory Board as well. I love to amplify my voice to demonstrate a student's perspectives and how issues affect the youth in my area. And also, I'm very excited to be here today and can't wait to have this discussion and hear everybody's opinions. Thank you for having me.
Oh, yeah, thank you for being a part of this. We were truly, truly honored to have you. Thank you all to all my panelists. The Town of Windsor thanks you. The Human Relations Commission thanks you, and thanks you for your time. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our main facilitator, who is Commissioner Cassie Copeland. Cassie, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we're going to start off with a short film snippet. I think we're going to watch the first few minutes, and then we're going to hop right into everything. All right. So after I share my screen, just give me a thumbs up so I know that you can see it. All right. So I'm going to share my screen here. All right. Just give me a thumbs up if you can see it. So I know everyone can see the screen. Awesome. All right, great. We're going to watch the first few minutes, and then I will send this link in the chat as well.
Some of you may be wondering, what's the deal with the GOP freak out over critical race theory? It's everywhere, and was even used as a GOP call to arms at a conservative Christian conference last week. The old Marxism used economics to gain control. The new Marxism uses identity politics. And the result is something that looks nothing like America. There's no reason to believe that this new Marxism will result in anything but what the old Marxism resulted in. Critical race theory is racism, pure and simple. and it should be rejected by every American of every race. Let me tell you right now, critical race theory is bigoted, it is a lie, and it is every bit as racist as the Klansmen in white sheets. Okay, but here's the thing. None of this is random. This is the result of a highly manufactured strategy created by seasoned political operatives looking for the perfect wedge issue to take back power. Something to combat the energy of the multiracial coalition that took Georgia, and something to replace Blue Lives Matter, since January 6th exposed that slogan as a sham. Conservatives in Congress took note and started chattering, which was then ingested into the feeder system of Fox News. The tagline disseminated, and the war against critical race theory took off. No one wants a boogeyman near their kids, and certainly not in their classrooms. The operatives know this. Those fears got played up, and now, along with the fear of trans kids taking over junior high handball, parents are fighting with school boards in cities and towns across the country over curricula that they believe teaches white kids that they are racist. None of this is actually happening. But who cares about a little old thing like the truth when you have the perfect campaign buzzword for 2022? It even has the magic word in it, race. Joining me now is Kimberlee Crenshaw, co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum, and the legal scholar who coined the term, critical race theory. So it is your fault, madame. I tripped over the curb this morning and I went, critical race theory? Damn you! You tripped me! It does everything bad. I mean, and the cicadas, y'all really need to stop with the cicadas critical race theory. That was not nice.
You can throw everything in the bag, everything in the bag.
So I just wrote down a few of the notes of what people are calling critical race theory. Marxism, racism, bigoted. Let's start with the Marxism. That's their favorite one. They're using that every single time. And I hate to ask dumb questions, so please don't think that I'm dumb. Is critical race theory Marxism?
Well, you know what? Here's the thing, Joy. Critical race theory is not so much a thing. It's a way of looking at a thing. It's a way of looking at race. It's a way of looking at why, after so many decades, centuries actually, since the emancipation, we have patterns of inequality that are enduring. They are stubborn. And the point of critical race theory originally was to think and talk about how law contributed to the subordinate status of African Americans, of indigenous people, and of an entire group of people who were coming to our shores from Asia. And the point was, quite frankly, to understand the problem in order to intervene in it, to understand why the greatest hopes for our republic were not being realized, even though these hopes were encoded in law. So critical race theory just inherits the beliefs and the hopes of Frederick Douglass, of Martin Luther King, who basically want the law to do for the freed people what the law did for enslavers. And we picked that up in the 70s and 80s after the civil rights movement to say, okay, so now we've had this big civil rights movement. We have all these laws in the books, but things really aren't looking as different as they should if we are really the society that we say we are. So we put about the task of understanding how law wasn't just the neutral referee. Law wasn't always on our side. In fact, law was less on our side than on our side. And we wanted to tell these stories in order to do better with the promises that are embedded in the Constitution. That's what's in critical race theory.
So is critical race theory, is there a K through 12 curriculum that right now is being taught? I'm sorry, I know it's a dumb question, but is there a K through 12 curriculum on critical race theory that's being taught in schools around this country?
Well, look, Joy, if it was news to most Americans that critical race theory was in K through 12, it was news to me too. I'm one of the co-authors of one of the few books on critical race theory. I think I would know if we were being taught in K through 12. I mean, basically, critical race theory, classic critical race theory, is a law school course. And it's really, not taught as widely as I would hope it would. Yeah. But here's the deal. This is not about whether anything called critical race theory is in K through 12. What they're calling critical race theory doesn't exist anyway. It is a backlash effort to reverse the racial reckoning unlike any we've seen in our lifetime. And as you pointed out at the beginning, they can't say, we're for racism. They can't say Derek Chauvin should have killed George Floyd with his hand in his pocket, looking like he was completely without a care in the world. They couldn't say that. So they looked around and found a strange sounding theory that they could put all of the grievances and resentments in and mobilize people around this boogeyman. And if our side can't really understand what's going on, it's going to work. It's worked in the past. It worked to end Reconstruction, and it can work to end this reckoning too.
And a gentleman named Christopher Rufo, who's very vigorously requested to be on the show, we're gonna take him up on it and let him come on this week and invite him on. He literally said, we've successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all the various cultural insanities under that brand category. To wit, Fox News has mentioned critical race theory nearly 1,300 times in the past 3.5 months. And we've now discovered that a lot of these parents that are showing up at school boards inveighing against their children being taught that they're, racist, turns out they are actually Republican activists, not just regular parents.
Big surprise there, right?
Yeah, it is not surprising at all. So I guess my last question to you would be, what do you worry is sort of the purpose of what they're trying to do? Because this is political. It is about getting out the white voters in 2022. Is there a bigger risk to naming critical race theory as some sort of Marxist plot?
Well, of course. I mean, the biggest risk is that this tried and true framing of anti-racism as racist against white people is going to win again. It won at the end of the Civil War when civil rights were framed as reverse discrimination against white people. It won after Brown versus Board of Education when integration was framed as damaging white children. And it could win now if people don't wake up and have a sense of what's at stake. So yeah, you're going to hear all these stories, cherry-pick stories. Turns out a lot of them were not verifiable that the other side is putting out there. You're not going to hear, and you should, what is happening with these bans. You're not going to hear that an essay by Ta-Nehisi Coates was the reason why a school teacher was fired. You're not going to hear about the affinity groups in colleges and universities and the programs, the educational programs that are being canceled. So we need to see materially what this is doing in order to weigh into this. If anyone was mobilized by last year, if anyone is concerned about what they saw on January 6th, then you are on our side with this and you need to get involved.
All right, now we're gonna pause here. All right, I'm just gonna hop on over to our slides. So if you would like a copy of that, of the video, just please let me know. Now we're going to get into a couple of guidelines and expectations. So as we have our conversations, these are some of the rules that we can follow to make sure that everyone feels safe and recognized in the space. I'll just briefly go over a couple of these, and then we'll just hop right on into a couple of our next items. We're going to listen to understand one another. I know we all come from diverse backgrounds with different ideas and understandings. We're going to lean into discomfort and feelings, knowing that, hey, someone might have a different opinion or understanding of this topic, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that I can't show you respect. We can still be respectful in this space. And online, it looks like making sure that we stay muted while other people are talking, and then just listening to someone's thought completely, and you can respond in the chat. Or make sure you stay muted until we have our audience Q&A. So don't worry, everyone out there in the audience, you will have time to participate as well. And speaking of that, we will have that moment to participate and converse with each other. And I really want to highlight that this is a challenge by choice. You don't have to converse if you don't want to, but the more you put into this conversation, the more you will get out of it, whether it's typing in the chat, whether it's raising your hands to be called on and share. And finally, we want to agree to disagree with grace, meaning that, you know what, someone might say that they're not into it. They're not into critical race theory, or they have a very different opinion. And that's okay. I'll say, great, we can agree to disagree, and I will still respect who you are as a person, and I want to understand who you are more. So these are our guidelines and expectations. We also want to just speak from our own experience. Moving right along, here's our quick agenda. We've already gotten through most of the first half of our agenda. As you'll see, there is some built-in time for an audience Q&A. So if you'd like to follow up with any of our panelists or with myself or Judge Kevin Washington on any points made, feel free to write down your questions. You can take notes. You can type in the chat. All of it is fine. So the purpose of today's event, as Judge Washington said, is to converse with one another on what critical race theory is and to reflect on the changes that we can make in our community by starting with ourselves. So it is not to change opinions. I don't want to change who you are. You are perfect as you are right now. I just want to have a conversation. That's all. I tell my students that too. They're like, you coming for me, this or that. No, I just want to have a conversation because then we can get to know one another better as humans. And then maybe we can also learn from each other. And speaking of learning from each other, here's some brief salient points about critical race theory. Now, I first learned about critical race theory when I was in undergrad and grad school, and it was in specialized programs at the University of Connecticut. So critical race theory in the basic form is an educational tool used to disrupt systems of oppression. There are currently 15 to 17 different core critical race theories. I know we don't have enough time to go through all 17. We're going to kind of have one and that trickles into many of them. But it is an educational tool. It's like a pencil. I can use this pencil to write. I can use it to draw. I can also use it to maybe stab my piece of meat to eat it. It has many different functions. And CRT is just like that. It's a tool that we can now use to help us understand moments of history. You can understand yourself better. And it is now officially required to be implemented in Connecticut as of this fall. But what people don't understand is that it's only to be offered as an elective, so that high school students may choose that elective if they want to. And as we saw in the news post, it is often, critical race theory is often talked about in butterfly language, meaning there's an entire rhetoric or special words that we use when talking about race theories in higher forms of academia, meaning, okay, if I'm in grad school or if I'm in law school or if I'm kind of in those spaces, we often talk about it differently. We use very abstract terms, complex words. So when it was brought into the media, it's kind of hard. It's kind of like we're talking butterfly language, right? It's not easy to understand. It actually took me, I think, 3 to 4 years to feel comfortable even talking about critical race theory without saying, did I get that right? Oh, well, what about this term? I don't quite understand. It took me a couple of years to feel comfortable with it. It is perceived as toxic when you're not formally or informally educated on it, and often politicized. I've seen both left, both right, both in the center people. Everyone's kind of pulled it apart as what they want to see instead of listening to understand, well, what is critical race theory really? And that kind of gets into these two pictures. I know that I'm a very visual learner, so these two pictures kind of show critical race theory in two different ways. The first way here is, this is the way that I was talking about. It's kind of like, wow, there's a lot that goes into this. Some of these critical race theories have been around for 50 to 60 years, but they have not been presented in a more public manner. Right? So a lot of this, it is going to seem confusing at times, which is why I'm presenting a little bit on it now. But at the core, remember, critical race theory is a tool. It is used to help us understand things better. All right, we're going to explore a little bit about intersectionality. Again, it is one of the many critical race theories. I like to see it as a pathway to yourself, because intersectionality is kind of like a cake, right? Think about all the different ingredients that go into a cake. We got the butter, we have baking soda, we have all these different things. That's like, that could be like my race, my sexual orientation, my religion. All these different things come in to make the cake, just like each one of us. So intersectionality is understanding these different parts of ourselves and how they merge together. So me and my cake will look different than Judge Washington's cake, and that'll look different than my mom and my dad and my brother and my cousins and everyone who I love around me. And she really goes to explain this a lot in Kimberlee Crenshaw in her book on intersectionality. It's a great read if you want to check that out later. And finally, before I turn it all over to our panelists, just trying to go through it as quick as possible, why intersectionality and why critical race theory? Intersectionality and a lot of the race theories at their core is really talking about discrimination within discrimination and tackling inequalities within inequalities. So really kind of pinpointing a lot of these intersections at ourselves, right? So I might be a multiracial woman, but then what does that mean to me? How can I really grapple apart? Well, I've had some moments as a woman that are different than what it means to be mixed race, right? So we're going to unpack this more with our panelists as we continue onward. And finally, it is our time for panelists and you all to come here and have our discussion. I know I went through that super quick. I will post the slides in the chat later on if you would like to review any information. I also have some office hours because I'm a teacher. So if you wanna sit and chat with me more, you can as well. I'm going to stop my screen share. Does anyone have any questions before we get started on all of our questions? No, good. All right, awesome. So each of the questions that we have, I'm going to ask each panelist to have roughly 2 to 3 minutes because I know we have lots of great things to talk about. I will also post the questions in the chat. So if you want to reread the question, think about it again, you can type your response in the chat or hold your responses till our audience question time. All right, so our first question here is going to go to all of the panelists. So our first question here is, I'm just going to pull it up. Excellent. Our first question is, in your own words, how would you describe critical race theory to others? What is it and what is it not? So panelists, whichever one of you is ready before I start to pick which one. Liana, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. In my definition, I would say that racism is not critical race theory is the idea that racism isn't a trait, it's something that is taught. And it is taught within our educational systems and legal systems. In our legal systems, I would say, to make it more, I'm somebody who needs like examples. So in our legal systems, I would say like police brutality and how that aspect works and how people are affected that way.
Excellent. Thanks so much. I really like how you defined that in your own words. Thanks so much for sharing. Any other panelists who would like to respond, feel free to unmute yourself. I also put the question in the chat.
I think for me, CRT is being able to, I usually try to explain it to my students as just pulling the curtain from behind Oz, right? Where you see all the different components that make a reality. Unfortunately, sometimes we know history is written by the victor, or you have a lot of your own personal prejudgments put into these things. And so if you see it as a full picture, you want to see the beauty that is throughout, that's created everything, and not just the lone point. So it's more of a encompassing everything. So.
Absolutely. I really like your metaphor about the Wizard of Oz and pulling the curtain. I really gave like a good understanding. Thanks for sharing. Any other panelists would like to answer this first question? How would you describe CRT? It's the same thing as critical race theory, just shortened.
So actually, I wanted to add on to Liana and Lillian. So this is actually like my first time, honestly, understanding what critical race theory is. But when I think of it, I kind of think of like a family tree. It's like, you know how it has all these different compartments. You have like the great-grandparents, you have the grandparents, you have cousins, whatever. So it's like all over the place, but they all come to like this source. You know what I mean? Like they're all related. Like, so all these different compartments. So when I'm thinking of critical race theory, it's not just about the race and like the judgments and the laws. It's like all of it, like, you know, working together, per se. And how you said in the beginning, because it's like an educational tool. So it's like, how do we understand this? You know what I mean? So that's really what I would define it as.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing. These are some great insights into how each of us define critical race theory, because how I might define it may be different than how you all understand it. Because again, it's a tool. It's like if I'm holding up a pencil, I might say, oh, I'm going to make a masterpiece with this. And someone else is like, I want to write my name. Again, different perspectives. Any other panelists like to share at this time before we move on to the second question? All right, no, all right, awesome. So then we are going to move on to our next question here. I'm going to put it in the chat so that everyone can see it as well. Our next question is, how does CRT give you a new perspective on how we treat one another? Do we need more or less of critical race theory in our society? So this is getting more into the actions and how we treat other people. All right, so I'll give you all a minute to think about it, and then panelists, whenever you're ready, you can unmute. And everyone else, if you'd like, you can type in the chat or you can write things down. Feel free to join along. And then I'm going to pick on my friend, Mr. Kevin Booker Jr. What do you think?
Stella, I think of a quote right now by Maya Angelou. When Maya Angelou once said, she said, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, you do better. So when you look, the question that you asked, do we need more or less CRT in our society? I would say we actually definitely need more. And why do we need more is the question, right? Because we want to create a more conscious society. This framework can help people better understand how racism runs deep, and I mean deep, in our society into the systems and structures that have been created. And once they know the truth, then they have the choice to change. So going back to Maya Angelou, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, you do better. And as CRT work is an educational tool to help us have a better understanding of history.
Absolutely. And I love how you brought in that quote there. One of my favorite authors personally as well. She's done some great work. But again, kind of using it to understand one another better. Thanks for sharing, Kevin Booker.
Thank you.
Any other panelists like to answer the question here about?
I just want to say, Cassie, that I think more is needed, because even even within your own race, there may be areas that you don't know about, and it's an educational tool. And what I was taught in undergraduate school on critical race theory is totally different from what I was taught when I went to law school. And even when I was in the military, the practice is totally different. So again, that speaks to the different ways that people interpret it, but at least you have a baseline to work from. It's interesting that this has been brought about to the high school level to educate our children. And I think that it really gives our young people a baseline knowledge of where you come from, what you're about, understanding why dialect is different, why culture is different, why, certain things are done in the Muslim community or the Asian community versus in the Black community or the white European community. It gives you that basis for understanding and why diversity exists. I think critical race theory should be taught, and it should be taught, for understanding, Not to say, oh, you're a bad white person or you're a bad Black person, or it's to understand the culture.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, Judge. And I see a lot of folks typing in the chat, so thank you so much. I'll read out a couple of comments. Thank you, Trish, who shared. I really liked what Liana said about CRT. Thank you. It made me think about acknowledging systemic racism and figuring out what we can do about it. And then I see another one here, and it's still confused, and that's okay, because honestly, when I first saw this, I was just like, who made this? It's so, it's very confusing and complex, right? Thinking about some personal experiences as well. So thank you for sharing. Any other panelists like to share for our second question?
To add on, I just saw it just like from that video. I was kind of thinking of it as in like words matter, because I feel like the way it's been approached is very different on both sides. Like Republicans are interpreting it very differently, and the Democrats are interpreting their own section. So I feel like there needs to be more knowledge, as both Judge Washington and Mr. Booker said. But we have to, in order for us to think about these discussions and continue to have these discussions on what critical race theory is, we need to first understand on how to be more considerate of each other's understanding and taking time to like listen to one another.
Absolutely. Well said. It's really like listening empathetically. When you were talking, I was thinking of empathy, and I'm not just listening to be like, oh, I heard what he said over there, but this was the response I already had in my head that I wanted to say to him before, you know, all the things happened. But it's listening to say, okay, oh, how are you feeling? So thank you so much for sharing that, Liana. And I also see there are some questions in the chat, so thank you for posting those. We'll get to those after our representative questions. Great.
Cassie, I think I would like to add to that. It's not just empathetic, right? I think people see the word critical and immediately have this jarring effect, right? And critical, to critique is not necessarily a negative thing, right? It's to pull apart and to look at all the different components. And so, you know, I think of the word critical and use the word analytical with it as well. You know, it started in the law stratosphere, and then it moved into education through actually the English classrooms, right? So that we can look at all the different perspectives and vantage points within a written piece. And so if we can do that in an analytical way, we could then really grow that empathy among within ourselves, but also to recognize that you're never too old to learn, and more importantly, you're never too old to unlearn something. And so we can always be a part of that change. And change isn't necessarily, you know, we have lawmakers on the panel, right? Yes, they are obviously, you know, vehicles of change, but we can start within our own homes, right? Like Judge Washington said, within our own cultures and communities. And so having conversations like this is really elevating the fact that we all have something to contribute in that analytical way, right?
Yep, absolutely. I really like how you're using the word analysis, because I often think that we don't take the time to like comprehend and understand, like, okay, this is what we are seeing, hearing, and consuming, whether it's within whether it's within education or within social media or all of these different diverse platforms. So thank you for sharing that, Lillian. All right, we're going to move on to the next two questions for our representatives, and then we're going to pause for an audience question. So thank you for those who are posting in the chat. We'll get to those pretty quick. So this one is specifically for Senator McCrory and Representative Gibson. I know, Judge, you brought up for this question for them. Would you please elaborate to us how Public Act 1912 came to life and your involvement with it? What has it got to do with critical race theory?
So is that?
Go ahead, Senator.
Well, I would like to say, I'm gonna let Bobby Representative Gibson talk about briefly about how it came to light. And I will talk about on the other end our expectation for it in our schools and in the Connecticut public school system. So Bobby, why don't you start and I'll finish off with you.
Thank you, Senator. That's teamwork right there, because I was thinking the same thing, Senator. So Public Act 1912 was a culmination of the perfect storm to tell a history of a people that had not been told. And it was the time to do it. Senator McCrory has been a stellar legislator and educator in our community for years, but it's something that he was doing by himself. I came along and I joined with him, and we were able to come together shoulder to shoulder and fight for this public law. One of our mentors, a fraternity brother of ours, his name is Dr. Ben Foster, had been thinking about having Black history put in schools for years. And so he noticed that I was there with Senator McCrory, and so he called a meeting. The initial meeting was held at Bloomfield, the Board of Education, in the office of Dr. James Thompson, another fraternity brother of ours, along with the head of the Board of Education from Bloomfield, Mr. Donald Harris, who's also a fraternity brother of ours. We had that initial meeting just to discuss what we could do to get this history taught. Senator McCrory was called in because he was the head of the Education Committee and the first Black head of the Education Committee, and we put our heads together and we developed a bill. And it was just time that educators and us as lawmakers were ready to teach this history. Along the same time, although it started off the teaching of Black history, Black and African-American history, our Latino and Puerto Rican brothers and sisters have a history as well. The histories aren't the same. We know that. Black people, African-American people came over as slaves and were important parts of the building of this nation. But our Hispanic, Latino, and Puerto Rican brothers and sisters also played a very important part in the culture and the establishment of this country, as well as being one of I hate using the word minority. I can't think of a better word right now, but outside of being white, is the largest group of people of color. There you go. How about that? In the United States. So we were able to foster a bill at the right time to meet the needs of our people. And it just so happened the bill passed after 400 years from whence the first slaves were on the shores, arrived on the shores, or enslaved people, let me say it that way, arrived on the shores of Virginia. So it was the right time for this bill. We still have more to do, but I'll stop right there because I know there are thoughts to add the theory of race to the bill. So maybe that's something we could talk about later, but that is how the bill was incorporated, and it's a good bill, but we still have a lot more to go on the bill. And I'll turn it over to Senator McCrory.
Thank you, Representative Gibson, for giving us the background on how we came to where we are today. So I'm gonna try to be as brief as possible, as succinct, and try to finish up before 6 o'clock. So if anyone have any question, they can ask. First, let's be clear. Critical race theory is not being taught in the Connecticut public schools. That is not what our bill was intended to discuss. What our bill, Black and Latino Studies bill, want to do is educate all our children in the state of Connecticut on history, not a theory. You're going to be taught, our children are going to be taught history. And what I believe that causes people a little discomfort is someone said you can't unlearn. And what I believe is causing any kind of discomfort is now that our children are going to be taught the true history of America and of this world. See, if you're teaching history and everything is good, then you're really not studying history. So what we want to do in this piece of legislation is provide all children across the state together a different way of viewing things. When I listen to the professor talk about how critical race theory, which is a law school course, has nothing to do with K through 12 education, but the concept is the way you look at things. So now all our children in the state of Connecticut will look at history through different sets of lenses. And we know it works because as a 28-year educator myself, when I taught my students and infuse African-American history into their curriculum at that time, you saw their eyes light up, they paid more attention, they can reflect to stories or events that have taken place in our country, and they can relate to it better and understand it better. For a quick example, so we talk about the Revolutionary War now. So if you take a course in Black and Latino studies, you're gonna understand everything that happened is true. Plus you also might learn about Prince Hall and his contributions to the American Revolutionary War. It's not like we're not telling the truth of America, but we're giving different perspectives. Or for example, when you talk about the Civil War, you might add the story, the contributions of the Buffalo Soldiers, right? And it might connect to some song that someone learned in their homes. And again, it's not always pretty because we know what happened and we know what those Buffalo Soldiers, who are Black soldiers, did to the Native Americans during that part. So it's making us look at things in a different perspective, right? And lastly, there's talk about people feeling a certain way, it's gonna make certain white kids feel this way. That's not true. And I honestly would say, when you're hearing this pushback from people at these events and stuff, I don't think they're concerned about how their children are feeling. Because these children, their children live in the 21st century, they go to school, they learn different things. I think they're more concerned about the questions their children might ask them and what their role was in American history. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing. I really like the way that both of you framed the Act of 1912 and being able to share more about that, and also sharing about how it's about perspective, right? Because I know as a teacher myself, when I go into the classroom, whether it's from preschool all the way clear through grade 12, when I am teaching and integrating critical race theory, I never present it in a way saying like, you have to believe this. This is something that like, it's a thing that you must do, right? I present it as, here's a story that we're gonna learn about today. And I want you to reflect and tell me how you feel. How do you connect to this? How do you not connect to this? And that's what critical race theory is. It's being able to have these conversations like how we are now and have these different understandings. So I thank both of you for answering that question. I have one more here, one more question here before you both gotta go, and I'll pop this in the chat as well. And it says, as the Public Act identifies, 27% of student population identifies as Hispanic or Latino, and 13% of African American, and 13% of the population is African American. Is there any plan to add an additional amendment to the Act to include Muslim, Asian, and Indigenous/Native American cultures as electives as well? And if so, what is the work being done to make that happen? And I'll post that question in the chat as well.
So I can answer that real quickly. So we passed this piece of legislation a year ago. And actually it was about 2 years ago. And we wanted to be very careful about how we roll this out. And we wanted to make sure we have all our facts in order, because we knew that this new way of looking at things, new way of educating people will be very challenging. So we got the input from professors from all over the country with a focus on professors and educators and students right here in the state of Connecticut to make sure our data is fact-proof or foolproof. So that's why we rolled it out. We're taking our time with it. In the meantime, yes, other groups has come to us and asked, what about this? What about that with us? We wanted to be very sure about this, but we did pass a piece of legislation last year that asked us to create in the same model for a course, a high school course, a K-8 course, a more inclusive model curriculum, so that the first time children are learning these concepts or ideas isn't when they get to high school. It will be embedded in their curriculum from K through 8. And also we passed legislation to prepare the study of Native American history last year also. So we're moving in the right direction. This took, like my colleague said, 400 years to get to right where we are, and pretty much was a perfect storm. You had the right people and the right leadership involved to push this through. Because at the end of the day, you have to get support from legislators on both sides of the aisle. And I will say that this legislation that we passed, Black Language Study, was very, very supported on both sides of the aisle. Matter of fact, I think we only had one vote against it in the Senate.
So, Priscilla, I know we're going to be going pretty soon. I'm not sure how the rest of this conversation will go. So I will have to add this, because this was an important part of the discussion when we started to put together Public Act 1912, because we had a big group of students who were monumental in the passing of this legislation. But the thought was to come up and add to this legislation the study of race and race relations. And as my colleague Senator McCrory said, this bill was about history. You see, history, and this is my theory, and again, it's open for discussion, but I would be remiss if I didn't say before I left. History is black and white, and it's factual. It's what actually happened. The study of history can lead to cause and effect. So say you take Harriet Tubman. I know my colleague mentioned the Buffalo Soldiers. You take Harriet Tubman. She had the Underground Railroad. There was a need for it because of slavery. And since there was a need for it, the cause was generated to take these people and get them to freedom. The effect could be argued that we have a number of people who got their freedom and we're going to have better lives for their families. That's black and white. To me, critical race theory it's not history. For me, it's about control and exposure of this control. So it's different. Critical race theory is a system that has been put in place to control people and have them live in a certain way. And now we're pulling back the layers of the onion and trying to understand these layers of this systematic control that's been affecting us. I can mention things that exist, such as redlining, gerrymandering, inequalities in education, prison overcrowding, the glass ceiling, accessibility to housing, and to actually the accessibility to voting, all come underneath these systems that have been created to put people in a box or hold people in a certain place. That is a little different than the teaching of history. So again, I had to add that about this invisible system out there that we don't even really know about, but we're now starting to have an awakening.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for sharing. I really like your metaphors about the system and really peeling it back layer by layer. Because when we look at it, it's like trying to eat a whole piece of a whole thing of pie without like saying, okay, I'm going to take a slice to understand really what I'm going into. So little bite-sized chunks. That's great. All right, now we're going to head into our audience Q&A. I know McCrory and Gibson, you have to. Would you like to say?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. You're able to stay.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for.
Appreciate the opportunity to communicate with the public. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Anytime. And please have us back again.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming. And then
Bye, Your Honor.
Bye-bye.
Yep.
Sure.
And if you have any questions specifically for any panelists, please reach out to myself or Judge Washington. I'm sure we'll be able to get you in contact. Right now, we're going to have our open dialogue and question. I saw a couple people had some questions here before. I'm just going to scroll up in the chat. Someone had a question about how does intersectionality kind of fit into the Women's Caucus, which brought up the conflict of times that didn't allow Black women to join the caucus. And we thought that although we were women, white women's struggle was a bit different. So I was just paraphrasing it there. And it says, how does this fit into CRT and intersectionality, or does it not at all? So thinking back into history, at that time, critical race theory wasn't really a thing, and I know it was very confusing, and still is confusing at times, because when we hear the words critical and theory, it's often very academic. When I think of theory, I think, this is a nice thing I can write about for a paper, right? But I had to literally unlearn that a theory is a tool. I had to teach myself that based off of professors, off of mentors, off of so many people. So now when I see the word theory, I think tool. And in terms of that question specifically, at that time, they were only looking at gender. So even though they were women, they were like, oh, we don't even see you as women because you're Black. So intersectionality allows people to see that you are not only Black and you are a woman. So you're finding the connection across those two identities, right? And then you can add in sexual orientation, right? So for that first question, if any panelists or judge, if you want to hop on in, go on ahead.
I'll let the ladies answer that, because that was geared toward our female listeners. That question was, so I think our female panelists can better answer that than I can, but I totally understand that question in regards to, how, because there were stories about, the lady that wasn't allowed to be a member of the American Revolution, Daughters of American Revolution, because she was Black. So I totally understand that concept, but I'll delineate to the ladies.
Awesome. So if any panelists, Lillian, Sage, or Liana, if you'd like to answer the question, go on ahead. How does critical race theory fit into the Women's Caucus, which I think was back in the 20s, maybe like right before the 20s, the 1920s? Yeah.
Well, I think it, we're talking about race and implications and systems of power and oppression. And they're one of the biggest systems that we tend to that culturally we tend not to use is the system of socioeconomic and demographics, right? And so if you think of, if you include that as part of this formula, in many countries, that power dynamic could get separated through gender, but also socioeconomics, and then obviously it falls under race as well. And so one of the things that we are now realizing is that the voice of the voiceless, right? And so it's really important to be able to see that I, as a female, should and can have the same impact and voice. And being from Latin America, sometimes, culturally, it hasn't always been there, or has it? And so you realize, like, in our families, the matriarch figure is extremely important. Latin America has had, to many people's surprise, a great number of female presidents. And so we have elevated the female voice in a way, but it really does depend on that. And sometimes it really is someone being able to be brave enough to say, wait a minute, I want to be heard, I have something to say. But I think in that system, we also had a lot of allies, right? We can't forget about those allies who were folks who opened the doors for women to say, or actually stopped that systemic oppression and said, no, wait, she actually has a voice, or they have something of worth to say. And because we had that allyship, we were also given that door was really open, right? And so it's one of those things that we want to make sure that we continue to do, because we have to. I know I had very strong female mentors in my family, and that allowed me to then be able to, as an educator, really raise the female voices of my students, so that they're not in the background. So.
Lillian, let me ask the question. Do you think that the Me Too movement has empowered you more in regards to, being able to discuss the issues? And I know there is a lot of machismo in the Latin community. How does that affect, people of Latin descent to be able to express, women to express themselves?
Well,
even with female presidents, there's still a lot of machismo in that community.
Well, I think that is also misunderstood in a way. Like I said, our culture is much of a matriarchal culture, right? I mean, the mother figure in our cultures is extremely important, and so, any husband, son, or anything will tell you that as well. And so it's important that we look at the history of all of that, as well as the implications. For me, like I said, I had very opinionated, very strong female figures that changed my life, really. I also went for my undergrad, I went to an all-women's college, which again, made that voice elevated even further. Even though I had wonderful male instructors, they were teaching me to use my voice, and that I was just one voice that could be elevated as everyone else's. And so, and that I should not take a back seat. And so I think that those things really have empowered me to be able to speak up. And I think so yeah, that I'll leave it at that.
Great.
Awesome. Thank you. These are some great questions so far. If you have a question at this time, feel free. You can type it in the chat. I'll try to type it in the chat if you want to verbally say it as well. But if any audience members, that's you all here, feel free. You can raise your actual hand, or you can click on your name and digitally raise your hand if you have a question. And I see right off the bat, James Madison, is that how you say your name? Would you like to
Yes.
Go ahead?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question, and I have an idea, and I'm a political conservative, and I think January 6th was an atrocity. Let's just be clear. And I think racism is a real problem. One of my concerns is that when the right expresses concerns about Marxism, it's dismissed by the left. And some of us, like me, I have no talking points, right? I genuinely fear Marxism because of the history of the 20th century. And I see the roots of critical race theory as an academic system, and I see connections to Marxism. I don't say that as a political talking point. I say that as a genuine concern. Now, one of my concerns, though, is as a relatively conservative thinker, individual rights, rule of law, and free markets are the cornerstone of conservative thinking, and racism prevents participation in that. And so my question is, I think there's a powerful thing here for people on the left to use those conservative values to say, racism is locking people out of those opportunities. That violates your own core principles. One person I did hear say that so far was that woman on the right during the video. She actually said, you're not adhering to the principles of the Constitution. That is a huge lever. So I would just ask, is there anyone really out there saying, you know what, instead of dismissing it, because I felt like the beginning of this conversation with that video was somewhat dismissive of the concerns of the right, not the talking points, not the politicians, genuine conservative thinkers like myself who look at the 20th century, fear Marxism, and see that cultural constructionism as the roots of CRT. I say, can you get rid of that part? Change it back to the conservative ideals and say, folks, you're not even living up to your own ideals. Martin Luther King did that fantastically. That would actually, because I hear a lot of concern here, and I agree. And every time I talk to people on the left, it's like, man, you guys, I love you guys, and you're right. But damn, I can see that Marxist root, and I can see why the right's freaking out. Can you use those conservative ideals more and use it that way? That's my question to the experts here.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And before everyone else goes, I just want to quickly respond. And I actually agree, because there are different critical race theories that you can use. There are some rooted in colonialism, and there's actually, I think, a more recent critical race theory that is actually rooted more in conservatism. Because when you see things on paper, it's different than reality, and then finding the blending. So the short answer is yes, there is a way, but then the backlash, or so to say, is kind of how can we now find a common ground? How can we find a common ground? Because I don't see that people on the left or the right are wrong. I even have people in my family who are conservative too. too. And honestly, that's okay, because I want to be able to have these conversations and say, okay, look, there are flaws within CRT, just like us as humans. But how can we find a perspective and say, oh, I don't want to call you out on this or not? So short answer is yes. But the long answer is it's going to take a while to find that kind of common ground of like, how can I find a way to relate to you and for us to be able to understand together? Because from individual to individual, it's one thing. But when you have an entire population of over 300 million people, that's the tricky part, is how can we communicate, right? And if any other panelists would like to share, go forth as well.
I think also the question that was just posted in the chat is, it goes back to my point and also to this gentleman's question, is it's critical thinking, right? This is not, yes, it's an emergency because we haven't really had the lens by which to do this for years. And so the critical thinking is to be able to see all those components that bring us together, right? It's not a right or left, right? Rich or poor, black or white, but all of it together in order to create a better society, in order to then grow as a country, right? And so if we individual grow, I'm a track and field coach, and I always say, like, I've got to bring in, you know, the lowest of the rung, right? If I bring the bottom up, then, you know, but they've got to be able to see themselves, right? So I can't just give the accolades to the top runners and forget about everyone else, right? Because together we're a whole team that brings it together, right? And so I think that's one of the things that's really important to look at those components.
Absolutely. Any other panelists? Sage, Liana, Kevin Booker Jr. I see lots of folks are typing in the chat as well.
There was a question from Lynn Andrews. Does the word critical mean it is critical as in thinking or as an emergency?
Lillian answered it for me. She did it. Thank you.
All right. You're welcome, Lynn. Thank you.
Awesome. And then here's our last one. I see James Copeland saying at James Madison. Oh, you both have name James. Cool. How is an educational theory Marxist? Discussing on racism and understanding, thinking, what does it say? How is critical thinking and discussing ideologies Marxist or threatening capitalism in favor of communism in any way? Again, not an attack, just we're trying to understand each other, finding the common ground, trying to, again, because I know it's confusing. There's so many terms. James, you want to share?
Yeah. Can I address that? Because I really want people to challenge me on this, right? But if I just said it in the chat, if you go to the critical race theory topic on Wikipedia, and I consider Wikipedia very authoritative, it's the world's encyclopedia at this point. Second paragraph, there's a link to critical theory. You go to critical theory, the term Marx, M-A-R-X, appears 23 times. And if you read through that, it comes down to social constructionism, postmodernism, et cetera. And so, you know, and again, this might sound a bunch like a mumbo jumbo. I'm no politician, right? I'm running for board of ed, but who cares? I don't care about Republican talking points. I genuinely fear Marxism. I really see the social constructionism, and I really see the postmodernism and a connection to the Marxism that's right on that page. You can click through yourself. And I say there's a connection there. And again, I got to contrast that. I love talking to people who support CRT because what they mean is not that. I get that, but can you get that chunk out of there so it doesn't freak out the right? And please don't dismiss the right, because all you're doing is adding more fuel to the Trump fire, and that's a disaster for all of us. Get that Marxism out. No, nobody on this call right now is a Marxist. Just got to say that, right? But the theoretical foundation is there. And if you could just shift that theoretical foundation to say individual rights, rule of law, and by the way, January 6th was a total corruption of the rule of law. I agree with that disaster, right? But it's like, can you get back to those fundamentals? So I think if you look at the theoretical foundation, it's there. The right looks at theoretical foundations more than the left realizes. You think it's a bunch of nerdy junk. It's like, no, people on the right sit around and talk about that stuff. And like, so that's all I'm saying is like that connection's there. It's not what people mean in real life. Can we somehow disconnect that and reallocate it like Martin Luther King used to do? He challenged America in his I Have a Dream speech to say, you guys aren't living up to your own ideals, you people. Come on, let's go. That shift, I think, is powerful.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it really, personally for me, it comes down to how we communicate with one another. Because I think the way that we can remove and understand and really connect is really listening to understand, okay, well, if this is what's happening, how can we now use different words or insert other things here to truly understand the issue? But the thing is, I can just say that all day, but I'm only one person. Collectively, just like Martin Luther King, we the people need to do this together, whether you're on any kind of side politically, no matter what kind of identity, shape, size you come in, we have to figure out, well, what does this look, feel, and sound like? So I think that the solution is going to be collaborative and community-based, but we need to work together. And that's why these types of events, having conversations, are so essential, right? It's great to have civil discourse, because sometimes when I do that in the classroom, the kids are like, oh my gosh, a different opinion, you're gonna hate me, I'm gonna have dislikes. And I'm like, no, it's not about that. It's about understanding that because of our differences, that creates diversity, that makes each one of us better people. So again, there's like a bunch of nuances, but that's just my take on it. If there's any other panelists or audience members who'd like to share before we move on to the next question. Go ahead, Judge.
Cassie, Shelley LeDuc said, I'm wondering how Wikipedia is more of an authority than the woman who coined the CRT term, who we heard talk about CRT in the video. And Monique Smith said, Wikipedia is not a reliable source. It can be edited by anyone at any time. And Shelley again said, I don't allow my students to quote Wikipedia as a reliable source for reasons that Monique said. And Dr. Carlita Cotton said, I appreciate your comments, James and Madison, and respect what you said. As a college professor, please allow me to clarify that Wikipedia is not a peer-reviewed nor scholarly reference. I'm happy to explain why offline. James responded, it does depend on what you believe about crowdsourcing, to be sure. I use it only because it's so public. There are other references. And Frank Termine said, check out Antonio Gramsci's and the Frankfurt School for Marxist Roots.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for reading out the comments. And I'd like to share that we are a resource to each other, right? I usually go to Wikipedia because, again, there's some great references, but at the same time, I also know, as some of my students remind me every day, they're like, I want to change all the words the to noodle. And I'm like, oh, okay. So, we all use resources differently, but we can be a great resource to one another. So I thank everyone for sharing in the chat and also sharing out loud. We're going to keep it moving here, and I'm going to start off with some more questions. So thank you, everyone, so much. And then I'm going to start off. So this is for all of our panelists, and if you'd like to follow along, feel free to jot things down in the chat or in your notebook, okay? All right, so our next question here is playing devil's advocate here. Why do we need to teach this, meaning CRT, in our schools? It's planting hate, isn't it? And if I were a white person, should I be ashamed? Because these are some real questions that have come from the audience, well, from a wide variety of audiences in Connecticut. So I'm going to post this in the chat for everyone. And panelists, whenever you're ready, you can share your thoughts. I'd love to hear from Kevin Booker, because I haven't heard from you in a little bit.
Thank you very much, Costello. I was just thinking about some of the questions that Mr. Madison asked, but one of the things I always ask people right away, when they have like questions in regards to like CRT and they're looking up on Wikipedia, you have to also ask yourself, what have you been taught when it comes to history? So for example, if I threw out 1919, Red Summer 1919, I threw out 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma, without looking it up on your site right now, and what happened in 1915 with Woodrow Wilson, there's a reason why we're having this discussion today when it comes to CRT theory. Critical race theory, right? So as Senator Doug McCrory just said, all of our children need to be taught the true history of our nation and the world. CRT will allow all of our children to look at things from a different lens. That's extremely important because CRT helps us to understand the why the system was created, right? The why. That's something that we always ask ourselves. And it's also said, as you said earlier, Costello, is a tool to help us better understand our history. So this leads me to when I think about the comments I hear on a daily basis, because I'm all over the state of Connecticut, right? I'm in places like Eastern, the deep north part of Connecticut. I'm all over. There's 169 municipalities in the state of Connecticut. 153 are predominantly white. Only 16 municipalities where people of color are concentrated in the state of Connecticut. So it's not planting hate, it's unsettling the hate that has been settled in and shakes it up. I hear the comments often, right? I do not want my white child to feel guilty or bad of what has happened. I do not want them to hate themselves because of their ancestors and what the ancestors have done. These are comments that I hear on a daily basis, right? So when I think about that, my question response is, should we not teach anything about Nazi Germany or the Holocaust, slavery, Japanese internment camps, the massacre of indigenous tribes, and other atrocities in our nation? Our country was built on hate. And if we do not know the true history of our nation, then we're going to continue repeating these things. In order to move forward from this virus of hate that has destroyed our nation, we have to come to terms with the monster that exists in history. We need to learn the truth about our history. We need to stop telling those lies. Like I remember as a child, we tell lies about the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, Santa Claus. We are building up lies that lead more anger in our children later on. In order to eradicate hate and fear, we have to come to terms with the evil that has hindered our progress in our country that we love. I hate it when my parents lied about the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, and the Easter Bunny. I'm just using those as examples because our country is perpetuated and built on lies on a daily basis. But when are we going to stop lying? We have to come to terms with our lives so that we can move forward. And as you said earlier, and as also the senator and the state rep said earlier, we have to start speaking about the truth. You do not have to feel guilty about something that has happened in the past if it did not personally treat someone in a certain way. However, you need to recognize the impact and the potential benefit that you had from the hate and the system that the hate has created and that existed. You can take that responsibility to recognize and become aware of how the past has impacted you and start changing the systems that are hatefully impacting others. And as M.K. Asante Jr. always says, when you make an observation, you have an obligation. So yes, when you make an observation, you have an obligation. As people in this call right now, we have an obligation to start telling the truth and start making sure that the next generation has a better understanding of our true history than all the fabrications that have been told throughout decades and decades. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing. Sage, Lillian, or Liana, would you like to share as well?
Yes,
no, I would like to, oh, Liana, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I wanted to say that I agree with what Mr. Booker was saying. I wanted to talk about guilting. I think for that second question, absolutely not. We're not here to point fingers or blame people. We're here to educate and provide this knowledge as we keep repeating. And it's just, we're providing this information to correct unchecked bias and to help advocate and amplify what we're really trying to teach. And that's that racism isn't a trait, but rather something that is taught. And if we keep telling people what's going on, as Mr. Booker said, we don't want to lie about something. We want to offer all the factual evidence that is there, and we want to make sure that people know what's happening. It's not to, we wouldn't want to give you half of a piece of a pie. We want to give you the full pie. And I think the best way in going about this is, as in this discussion, listening to everybody's ideas, however controversial they are, and just encouraging us to be inclusive, because we are, in Windsor at least, we have a very diverse county, and we need to take the time to be understanding and listen to others on their personal views and values, like James Madison's, and there were other people like Lane Andrews, and everybody's opinions. And taking that time allows us to have these discussions and take away meaningful takeaways, and in order to have some type of bridge of understanding.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing. I see Sage and then Lillian.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liana and Mr. Booker. Like, I think you guys and everyone, even Mr. Madison, everyone has amazing perspectives. And I think, just to add on to Liana, these are like the conversations we do need to break down like all of this like catastrophe. Like, it's just like, you know, oh, what are we talking about? What are we talking about? But it's like slowing it down so we understand each piece. Like Liana said, we don't want just a piece of the pie, we want the full pie. Like, we need to understand all these different points, because then it can get confusing. And like, I think what we said in the beginning, like we're talking about how it's black and white, or like there's two sides. And like back to the video, like, yeah, we see the person on the right and they like have all these points, right? But we can't say they're wrong. They just have a different point of view. So the left side is not wrong as well. They have a different point of view. So it's now just listening to each other and like saying, okay, I see your perspective on that. I might disagree, but this is how I would like disagree. So you understand like what I'm trying to say, essentially. And I wanted to answer the question again. I'm trying to find it. Could you repeat it, Cassie? Because I lost it.
Yeah, sure thing. So our question here is, playing devil's advocate here, why do we need to teach critical race theory in our schools? Isn't it planting hate? And if I were a white person, should I be ashamed?
Yeah, and just as a student, like me and Liana are in high school right now. And right now I'm in US history. And I'm gonna be honest, like I love learning. So I love my teacher as well. So it's just like taking the time to understand. Maybe I might not, like, it's not really not agree. It's just like, I've been learning about this for years. And I wanted to, like, since kindergarten or like middle school, I would love to learn about my own history. You know what I mean? Like, because it's just like, who am I? Like, who are we? Like, we all are different. And like, if you're just learning about the same thing, okay, what about this side? So I definitely think, like how we said, it's an educational tool. We need to use this tool to advance like our understanding of critical race theory and race itself. And it's not negative or positive. I think it's really neutral. It's just like, how you understand it, you know? And that's it. I'll pass it on to Lillian.
Yeah, I think both Liana and Sage are the perfect examples of what my students are saying. I actually asked this question to my students just last week, and I have my students span, you know, demographics throughout, and they all said, you know, we like the fact that we are now having more of these honest and real conversations and in class. And they like the fact that we are, as teachers, we're seeing that they are mature enough to have some of these harder conversations. And hard conversations aren't what we should be shielding our children from, because that's how they're going to grow and that's how they're going to become resilient. And so one of the things that my students have said is the same as Liana and Sage. You know, they're like sponges and they just want all this information. And like Kevin Booker said, it's being able to present all of the facts and not have omission of facts, right? Because what we are seeing right now, and I had this conversation with my dad not too long ago when it came about Christopher Columbus, and it was, we have to sometimes re-study history because we have to find out those gaps of omission, right? That omission that was left out. In order to really truly see the entire picture. And as we grow and we become more inquisitive, then we have a better understanding of really how great this country is. But this country was founded by all of these individuals creating it, you know, from its inception, right? And so we can't just forget that people weren't here before, colonialism, right? They created, actually, if you having read Thomas Jefferson's Constitutional Thoughts, a huge part of Thomas Jefferson's Constitutional Thoughts were largely based on the Iroquois nation's system of governance. And so it's really important for us to really acknowledge, all the good things that we're doing in order to grow as a nation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone, for providing your insights. And I see folks are participating in the chat, so I'm going to turn it over to Judge. Would you like to read some of the amazing conversations that's been going on here in the chat?
Sure, Cassie. And I'm, you all can read it in its entirety. I'm just going to pick out some salient ones. Trish Urzo said, I was literally talking to my mom about this today. I'm white. I think it's important that white people realize how we benefited from our whiteness. I think that's a lot different from being ashamed. Wamba Ortiz Raquel said, I miss encyclopedias. Pamela Lockhart said, I just looked at Wikipedia. The previous speaker claims of 23 times do not show up in my search. James Madison said, I agree with a massive revisiting of history, understanding history best done in the future. Rain Michelle Eiffel said, as a white person, you should be proud that you take time to consider why your fellow Americans of a different hue often find themselves experiencing systematic racism. And Pamela said, that sounds like a fear tactic. This sounds like a fear tactic. Rebecca Jacobson said, I'm enjoying the actual conversation on this so much. And James said, I want the racial understanding and revisiting of history to get 100% of the focus. That's why if we can gut the Marxist part, the right neither has to fear it or can use it as a criticism. Lynn Andrews said, would it help if CRT were renamed so it is not confused with Marxism or anything to do with Karl Marx? And then James makes some points there. Rebecca said, I think the term critical race theory is misleading in K-12. It should just be understanding history and how not to repeat it.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin, for reading out some of these.
You're welcome.
I'm going to highlight here that Frank, you said some, certainly not all, devotees of Connecticut have taught ancestral guilt, and that's what people have negatively reacted to. So thinking about how we can be proactive versus reactive, because being reactive is easier. It's like, I can just kind of sit back. I can just react. I can hit that like button. I can have that emoji, right? But being proactive here actually gets into our next question, which is geared towards Lillian and Kevin, but I invite everyone to really think about it here as well. All right, and I'm going to put it in the chat as well. So our question here is, as educators and administrators in the classroom, how does critical race theory impact your curriculum in either your public or private schools? So thinking about how we see this in action. So Lillian and Kevin, go on ahead whenever you are ready.
Lillian, all yours. I'll let you go.
Actually, well, for me, I look at my students, right? And even though I have lectures and topics that I want, I need to make sure that I present the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? Which is what I tell my kids all the time. And I want to make sure that they see themselves in the course that I'm teaching, right? There's a great poem that I started teaching about 20 years ago. And it's called Mis Dos Abuelos. And it talks about the journey of a Latino person who is Afro-Latino person, the author. And he talks about his both sides of his family, right? The white side and the black side. And he talks very detailed about the struggles both sides. And then at the end, the poem ends with the two grandfathers calling each other out. And it's important, when I first started teaching this poem, my students were like, you're the only one who has taught me something like this, where you see that it was, I could see myself here, or I could see that, you know, the white side wasn't this, you know, killed the black side, or the black side wasn't this, you know, uncultured person, but that they both created this entity who I am now. And that realization really was when CRT clicked in my head, right? You know, I love the law and I love reading about these theories. As an educator, that was the moment that it all made sense. Like, I need to make sure that we are presenting facts, and that we are presenting, that our students are being able to see themselves in what they're studying. You know, and so it's important to be able to have this wealth, because it's like a quilt, right? The beauty of your quilt is having all of these different components. And so we need to make sure that all of those components are elevated, and that we elevate the voices of those who have been suppressed in all reality, and suppressed for many different reasons. It could be for gender, it could be for whatever it is. And I think also we have to realize that education is not, doesn't fall under binary lines. Education, there's a lot of different types of education, right? And books are great. I'm a big fat nerd, I love them. But education is also the community and the culture from those that you are with, right? And learning from them and seeing things from their perspective. And so, you know, I always say to my students, I'm going to present to you a generally acceptable interpretation of this work. You know, it's not the author, I'm not the author, only the author knows what their intent was, but that they are, when they read a piece, they are also part of that journey and that education, because they have to, their own lives as students and their experiences will provide multiple lenses by which they are reading something as well. And so a piece becomes completely alive once the student allows themselves to realize that everything that they are helps them see this piece of literature or art in a very different way. And so you can't, you know, the reader is part of that. The student is part of that journey, right? It's not just teacher focused, it has to be student focused. And so that's the really important part of where I see CRT. And it's not, it's been around for 50 years. It's not going to go anywhere. It came out of, you know, I read about it in 1995, you know, and didn't really think about CRT before until all of a sudden it started popping out in the news. But it's something that I have chosen to use those lenses in order to navigate my life, just because of my experiences. And I think my students are better for it. And I think that, you know, I'm helping educate the future leaders of tomorrow. And so I would do them a disservice if I didn't allow them to see themselves in that. So.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing. I really like how you described it as a choice, right? It's kind of like, well, I want to choose to understand and use this as a tool. Because again, like, you don't have to, you choose to. So I thank you so much for sharing, Lillian. Kevin Booker Jr., would you like to share next?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Costello. First of all, I'd like to say, I love being an educator. You know, I would do this, I'm going to be educated to the day I die. Like, I love teaching. Teaching is something that I would do without getting paid, because I love it so much. I love the lives that I impact. So for all the educators that are in this call, you know, kudos to you. You know, and because this is work that is from our heart and our soul, and we are dedicated to this work. So I'm all about the voices that have been suppressed and oppressed. And I've taught middle school, high school, 2-year college, state, and private. But one thing about education, I would have to say more importantly, is that when we talk about teaching race and about racism, we need to have conscious educators. Our teachers need to know more than just what is taught in the textbook. Our teachers need to have lived experiences in a diverse communities and be able to teach beyond the textbook. That's something that I always have done in my own classroom. Like I'll put a little blurb about something historical in my class during a theme or a month. You know, like we just had Hispanic Heritage Month. I put something in my class that relates to Hispanic Heritage Month every single day, just to put a spotlight, telling the truth, letting your students know the truth. And even if you did not grow up in a diverse community, you can become an educator who has consciously and consistently researched and reflected on the impact that racism has had in your life. You can be an effective educator if you have checked your own preconceived biases. It is important to tell your students that you have biases and that you are also working on them consistently every single day, because you're modeling that behavior. Teachers who are vulnerable and who are transparent with their students will make a tremendous impact on them. It enables students to make connections to the learning at a personal level. Also, it is important for schools to engage with other schools that have different demographics, extremely important, and to connect and discuss issues of diversity and race. As attorney Brian Stevenson said, we cannot create justice without getting close to places where injustices prevail. We have to get proximate. We have to be in proximity to one another to really start creating change, to educate our students, right? So we have to role model and model that behavior. The stuff that we want to see continue to change, we have to model that behavior. Our students are with us 8 hours a day. So we have to really model that type of behavior. And in order to learn more about others' living experiences, we have to get to know them. We have to get proximate. We have to create opportunities for our students to come together, to learn about different communities and different life experiences. This is how we build empathy. This is how we start to continue to grow. This is how we actually start building those bridges that we want to have within this group, in this call today. As I said earlier in this call, in the state of Connecticut, there are 169 municipalities. 153 municipalities are predominantly white. 16 municipalities where people of color are concentrated. We have to figure out ways how to build those bridges so we can have these discussions, so that when we talk about CRT, when we are talking about implementing curriculum, we are talking about the truth and what needs to be told in these classrooms, then we will have these conversations, these courageous conversations, and we will begin to move our state forward and our communities forward and the town of Windsor forward. But we have to start with these conversations and becoming more proximate with each other so we can look at each other as human beings. Human beings. That's one of the issues that I see all the time. And it doesn't matter your age. A lot of times if it's taught, it's going to continue on and fester. So remember, we have to become Brian proximate. And as Brian Stevenson said, we cannot create justice without getting close to places where injustices prevail. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing, Kevin Booker. I see a lot of folks in the chat are sharing comments that are agreeing and also thinking back to our earlier conversation. I'm actually, for our next question, going to pose one from the audience here before we move into our kind of final question with the students and all panelists here. I saw James posted, does critical race theory advocate for equality of process or equality of outcome, or maybe even something else? And before folks answer the question, go ahead, Judge.
And Cassie, I just wanted to say that there were several comments. Shelley LeDuc also said that the addition on our panelists of the two young ladies is outstanding. So thank you, young ladies. You are very welcome and vibrant, and we are hearing you too. So I think that is And Miss Florence, I saw her hands clapping there. Thank you, young ladies. It's very important to listen to the view of our youth. Thank you. And Cassie, sometimes I forget you're an educator too. Did you have a perspective on this? And I see Dr. Carlita Cotton. I wondered if she has a perspective before we move on quite quickly.
Go ahead, Dr.
LaDuke too.
Oh, yes, true. Yes. Yeah, Dr. Cotton, you want to go first?
No, I'm just playing devil's advocate. But I just simply put in the chat that I have to pause every time I hear the words CRT, because in my teaching experiences, that stands for culturally relevant teaching, which is not unlike the CRT that you're discussing. So I always have to ask people to clarify for me, but I'm giving away my age now. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, thinking about, I know that Kevin Booker and Lillian, you're talking about how a lot of it has to come from the teachers, and it's not just professional development, but it's really looking internally at who you are and how we kind of educate others. It's not just speaking from passion and experience, but also thinking about how am I going to form a relationship and connect? Because students won't learn. If they don't like you, they'll just be like, nope, boop, bye. And it's like, oh, okay, like here we are. They won't be receptive to anything, no matter what background they're from. They not only have to like you, but then you have to find a way to connect with them, right? So I think from an educator's perspective, I always want to keep that in mind. And to your point, Dr. Cotton, as well, it is confusing. Some of the acronyms and the language, again, it's butterfly language. There's just so many things, and they're constantly changing because we are human. We change. We're not static, right? So that's why it's kind of hard to unpack it. And I really appreciate your point, James Madison, because it's confusing. Sometimes language just needs to be changed, but sometimes that takes time because we need to really meet one another with where we're at and be like, okay, I got to take it one step at a time, right? So I appreciate everyone's voices in the space here. And that really brings us to our next question here, because a lot of things are going on. Yeah,
really quickly, can I add, I think that the teachers and educators are doing a lot of professional development. One of the things that my students said last week when we were having this conversation said, we want to see those higher administrators also walking this walk, because they're the ones who are making the decisions on those curricula. They're the ones, if a student goes to a teacher and talks about being non-binary, and the administrator doesn't know what that means, we have a problem, right? And so it is really important, because as educators, we can only go as far as our administrators allow us to go to. And it's really important for administrators to be down in those trenches and really unlearning some of the things or relearning some of the issues that they've learned before, and so I think that's just my last little plug there. So.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing. I know, Kevin Booker, you want to add here? Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to know if Shelley LaDuke, she's a really great teacher, if she had a response to that question as well. She's doing some really great work at EastCon.
Go ahead, Shelley, if you're here, you want to share out?
Yeah, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, so our question here for our educators is, as educators and administrators in the classroom, how does critical race theory impact your curriculum in either your public or private schools?
Oh, I had put into the chat one thing that I learned this summer from somebody that came into in-service at EastCon was to just be transparent. And so I say a lot of, I'm just learning stuff that I wish that I had known, 30 years ago when I started teaching. But I will say to my students, I just learned about this haircut thing. Like, women of color aren't allowed to have natural hair at work. I'm appalled at this, and I didn't know. But the second step is, why didn't I know this? Because I'm in a place of privilege. Being white, I didn't need to worry about this. And why? And what has that done? How does that affect me? How does that affect all of us where we are? How does that affect you? And some of my students, a student from Puerto Rico didn't know, and I didn't know up until a couple of years ago, about not being allowed to sell a house to a person of color. And they couldn't believe why, how can that be? How, what do you mean you can sell a house to anybody? And so I had to explain to them, and I explained to them, I just learned this, and they didn't know it. And what happens now that we all know this? And being transparent about what I didn't know is really, they think I'm the teacher. They think, I teach adults, and they think I know everything. And these are the things, this tell the truth, I put in quotes because Kevin said that. I think we need to tell the truth, and we need to talk about what the truth means.
Absolutely. And whose truth and from whose perspective, and how we are going to then continue forward together. So thank you so much for sharing, Shelly.
Yep.
Awesome. And we're about to go into our final 3 questions. I'm going to have the students start us off with these, and then I'm going to have Lillian and Kevin come on in. All right, so for our final 3 questions, which I'm putting in the chat right now here, and I see folks are also conversing as well with some takeaways. So for our final questions here, it is, has this, meaning critical race theory, been explained to you by your parents or teachers? And why is it important that critical race theory is taught in high school, or should we maybe only save that for college? So I'm going to turn it to Sage and then Liana to share from a student perspective on these questions.
It definitely should be taught in high school. I don't think we should wait until college. Like, we do need to learn about this now. Like, the more that we wait, it's going to be very confusing when I wouldn't say confusing when we get there, but it's just, we're wasting time. And I think we do need to know about the truth now. And I loved what Miss LeDuc, I think that's how you say your name, said about transparency. Like, we need to know the truth. We need to discuss it now. We need to have these discussions ongoing. And because, especially like our the children in middle school, like the more that we wait, then we start seeing, like, looking at the media. Like, that was something I was like looking into earlier when we were mentioning certain things. Like, media is like a distraction right now for my generation, I have to say. Like, we look at all these things on the media and it distracts us. So honestly, like, in class, when we're actually seeing the teacher, actually seeing our peers, and looking at the board, whatever you have on the screen, saying, all right, this is this, right? If we're talking about maybe police brutality, or talking about maybe Rosa Parks, anything, but just honestly taking the time to like look and dive into the culture and the history and knowing the truth of both sides, it's definitely something we definitely need to do now. So Liana, you can add on if you want, but that's my, yeah.
Awesome, thanks for sharing. Go ahead, Liana.
I definitely agree with Sage. I feel like it's something we need to learn right now. Me, myself, personally, I didn't really know a lot about critical race theory until I started like researching it. And I feel like in instances, it would have been very helpful. It's very helpful to like understand what this is talking about, because in high school, you're telling these kids to pick, you're telling them to pick their majors and all this stuff for college, and you're constantly telling seniors and juniors to prepare for college and to get ready for this. But how can we prepare for active members in society without teaching them how to respect one another? And by ignoring that aspect, we're not taking the time to we're not taking the time to directly address issues within the classroom. Because if we're starting with this one step, and I think that one step is teaching everybody about their own history, because by allowing these discussions, I know a lot of my friends and we were very excited to learn about, we were given this opportunity to learn about our own history. And by first starting with that, issue, we can later talk about all the other aspects that come with it. And that will prepare us to be a more positive environment and a better future.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Liana and Sage. I see, Nathan, you got your hand up. Would you like to share as well? Because I know you got a great perspective. Go ahead, my friend.
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. I just want to first congratulate Liana and Sage. You guys have been doing an amazing job. I've just been listening the whole time. You guys have really been holding it down. I would have been scared also to do this at that age, but you guys have been doing a great job. I just wanted to say that to answer the question, the question said, did your parents teach you about CRT? And I believe every Black person has gotten at least a little snippet of it. It may not seem with all the terminology and the butterfly terms, as you said, but at a certain age, once you get your driver's license, your parents are going to give you a little talk about the police, or you're going to go through a class and you'll learn about redistricting and redlining, or you'll, even as I just found out this year, I've learned that they were doing like passes for beaches in Connecticut. So if you weren't from certain areas, you couldn't be able to go to certain beaches in Connecticut. So it's definitely something that's spoken about. Maybe it would be more receptive if it was named class about unfair rules and laws in the world, but a lot of the stuff gets lost in terminology sometimes. I'm not claiming to be an expert, but that's why I logged on here to learn a little bit more, and it's definitely been great. You guys have been doing a great job. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing, Nathan. It's also about like, we're always learning, right? There's never an end point of like, oh, I've done, like, I got this. Even after you have degrees, even if you, after a long life, we're still here to learn together. I hope that maybe when I'm like in my 80s or 90s, I'll just be learning forever, because it's just, I know it's something I'm passionate about, but as humans, we're always evolving and changing as we go. So thank you so much for sharing, Nathan, Sage, and Liana. I'm going to turn over to Kevin Booker and then Lillian, and then we're going to close on out. So go ahead, Kevin Booker.
Can you say the question one more time, please?
Yeah, sure thing. So our questions here are, has critical race theory been explained to you by your parents or teachers? And why is it important that critical race theory is taught in high school, or should we save it for college?
Right, absolutely. So I would kind of like piggyback off of what Nathan said earlier. You know, growing up in Hartford and growing up in the community I grew up in a very conscious community where race was always an issue. I remember my mother was reading this book called Why Coffee Make Me Black. And she was saying to me, and I was like fourth grade. And I remember my mother just talking about colorism and talking about the history of our nation. And I remember in middle school, it was required for me to memorize 5 Langston Hughes poems. So my community made it conscious. It was required for me to know about my culture, know the truth about how I was raised, know the things that were preparing me for, you know, how to navigate through white spaces. When I had to actually step out of my comfort zone. In the community, they were building me up. You know, as there's an African proverb that says, it takes a village to raise a child. That's what my community did for me. And it wasn't called CRT or critical race theory, because I want to make sure I'm clear about it, as Dr. Cotton said earlier. But it's very important that, you know, within our community, it's always talked about the truth, knowing your history. Because if you know your history, you know where you're going. So do I think it should be taught in high schools? Absolutely. As an educator, I think the truth should be taught. You know, maybe we change the wording on it, because I've been teaching the true history of this nation since I became a teacher. So, and I watched my students grow. And I think every student should know the true history behind what has occurred in this nation, because it builds a better understanding. It builds a better understanding of what direction we need to go in. And then you begin to reflect on yourself and you say, what can I do for this nation? What can I do for my community? What can I do in my household to make things better for the next generation and also for myself? So yes, it should be taught, and it should be taught properly. And people who are teaching it, they should make sure they also check their own preconceived notions and biases on a daily basis, because we want to make sure we're not perpetuating and bringing on harmful and toxic energy to our students on a daily basis. So yes, I agree, it should be taught in high school and at undergraduate level and at graduate level, so we can make sure all of our students and everyone who is graduating throughout the world knows the true history of their nation and their community as well. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing. I like your point to how we have to really look at ourselves in the mirror and like call out ourselves, right? So thank you so much for sharing. Lillian, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. You know, I've seen racism in my own family, and you know, a caste system within my family. But I was very lucky that I had my aunt and uncle who really raised me and inculcated a lot of these acceptance and celebrations of different types of people. And for me, as an educator and as a parent, I love being in this town, right? Windsor is so diverse. I remember, you know, Mrs. Fury, when she was teaching my children, you know, and to read, that she was bringing different types of voices into their schools, right, into the books. And it really, for me, I can simplify it to the word access, right? I think my students deserve the best, which is why, you know, I teach and I provide these little morsels of truth for them. And access is really important, right? And if they have access to books, they can see themselves and they could learn. If you reread a book, you will see the lens by which you are at that point in time. And so access is really important. Having a myriad of voices representative in the different books that the kids have at school, the posters that we put up on the classroom. And so while it may not be critical race theory, having access to those voices is really important, even at the youngest level, right? Being able to see that people can celebrate in different ways and have different celebrations of people and events and holidays. In high school, I think we don't give young people the credit that they deserve. I think Liana and Sage are the perfect examples here of they're pretty smart. You know, I don't think I was asking these questions when I was their age. And I think that clearly educators are moving in the right direction in order to have these courageous conversations, as Kevin Booker said, you know, that is really important. And as they grow, you become a little bit more critical, right? You become a little bit more specific as to what this is in order to change the systemic oppression that has been existing, right? But it starts from the very beginning, right? So it's the books that we choose to read to our children. You know, at Loomis, we have a faculty children group. And one of the things that I love to do is I worked with the librarian on campus to create library lists and suggestions of books that parents could be reading to their kids throughout, right? So it's not just Hispanic or Latina History Month, right? But that they could do it whenever throughout their year, but they don't necessarily know where to start. So if we give them access to these things, then I think we're going to the core and the foundation of the problem. So that's my 2 cents.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. I really like how you coined accessibility and representation and how a lot of this is merging through our perception, not just as educators, but meeting our students' needs with where they're at, saying, I see you, I hear you, and I want to meet you where you're at. Not like by the standard, not by, oh, well, this is the math problem, this is the book we're reading, really holistically seeing the child and the student for who they are and what they need. So thank you so much for sharing that, Lillian. And before I turn it over to Judge for our closing thoughts, I'm going to share my screen one more time and share a couple of resources with you all. All right, so I'm about to pop the link to our slideshow in the chat in just a second. So if you would like to continue to educate yourself, you can click on all 6 of these links. I want to shout out to Lillian for sending me some of these, and then I also had some up my sleeve as well here. You can also click on the picture as well if you'd like to read more about critical race theory. One of my good dear friends is also starting a course on understanding white supremacy. So if you would like to join, please, you can click on the link. I think it's like $100 or something like that to join. If you need help with funding, there are scholarships available, but he is a phenomenal scholar, Bishop Selders. So I highly recommend you check out his work because he's not just only a great human, but this is going to be a great course. And finally, here are some ways to get involved, right? We had this amazing conversation, right? But what are we going to do about it? How are we going to impact the people in Connecticut and our communities, right? You can find a lot of different initiatives here. So again, I'm gonna send this to you all so you'll have some more time to read about it. And here's our final list. I just want to highlight that action can come in many forms. There's no right or wrong way to do action. There are only many ways, right? You can post credible articles on social media. You can educate yourselves. You can come to online events. You can listen to narratives that are different from yours, whether it's podcasts or listening to music, attending protests, vigils. There's no hierarchy of action. It's just a way of us as a people to understand one another better and build stronger, more empathetic relationships. All right, so that is our main points here, and I'm going to now stop my screen share and turn it over to Judge Kevin Washington here to share out a bit. Go ahead, my friend.
Welcome. Thank you, Cassie, for facilitating this event this evening. We have a lot to talk about, and we still have a lot to talk about. 2 hours is not enough, but 2 hours is enough. The concept of critical race theory is varied, just like Cassie said, and through our presentations. You know, I often wonder, should this be a required course in corporate America, in health disparities, and understanding that? Henrietta Lacks and syphilis and the Tuskegee Airmen, you know, there should be a course in health insurance and in corporate America, in dealing with Aetna and slavery, and you know, they would insure and not insure. But it's a lot of reading that needs to be done and understanding. With that, and Lillian, thank you so much for being a part. Leon and Sage, I appreciate you being a part. Cassie, I love you, and I thank you for being our facilitator. Senator Douglas McQuarrie and Representative Bobby Gibson, thank them for being a part. Every last one of you who joined this conversation, I'm appreciative of. If you have any comments, if you like what we presented, please let the town of Windsor know so that they know we're doing the work when we're putting the effort in. Our next conversation on race is dealing with colorism. If you see this paper bag, I'm too dark, I would not pass. But if you hold this up to Lillian, she could get in. Or if you hold this up to Cassie, she could get in. So in November, and watch for the invitations, we will be sending out our next conversation on race. Will deal with colorism and what that's all about. And you will receive the invitation, and everyone should click on it. Also, our One Book, One Windsor selection for this year is John Lewis's Across the Bridge. John Lewis's Across the Bridge. So we're gonna put that out there. Thank you, audience. We're looking at some field trips for everyone. Some of the museums are not, like the African American Museum is not accepting groups. So, but the Pequot Museum is. So it's a possibility we may be making a trip down to Pequot. And we hope that you join us. Someone asked who the organizers of this event was. It was myself and Cassie. Cassie and I work very closely together to put things in, come up with great discussions. This was a topic I put out there, and the next one on colorism. Cassie works very close, and I encouraged her to be a commissioner because I think she has a bright future as a commissioner. And I look forward to see what this young lady is going to do. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of this. I look forward to seeing you next month in November on our discussion on colorism. Make sure you register again, and make sure that you comment to the town of Windsor, you know, about what you thought about this. And if you have any questions or comments, please send us an email. We do have a page, like I said, on the town of Windsor website. Thank you very much. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Have a great week and take care of yourselves. Be safe and make sure you wear your mask and wash your hands. Take care, everybody. Good night.
Thank you, Judge Washington.
Thank you.
Costello.
Thank you so much.
And Kevin Butler, next time, be on time.
I love you, man.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.